welcome to How I Got Here, the inside stories of startups and innovation in travel and transportation, with your hosts, PhocusWire's Kevin May and Mozio's David Litwak.
Good morning, wherever you are. Welcome to another episode of How I Got Here. This is Mozio and PhocusWire's co-produced regular podcast about startups in the transportation, travel, hospitality sector. So thanks everybody for joining us. Delighted here, this particular episode, to be joined by the CEO of Wanderu, that's Polina Raygorodskaya. So, hello, Polina. We'll introduce you a little bit first. So, the company Wanderu, for those that don't know, was created in 2011. It's based in the lovely city of Boston in the northeast of the US. It's the leading ground travel search in North America. Ground in particular, to helping millions of people find great deals on buses and train travel. So first of all, very much welcome to you, Polina.
Thank you very much for having me.
That's all right. I mean, I've just been looking through your LinkedIn a couple of hours ago. You've been featured in lots of places. Maybe we'll get to that in a little while later. But I was very much interested in the magazine, the Inc. magazine 30 Under 30, and hopefully we'll get to that because there were some interesting elements there, which I think would be pretty important for our audience. But before we get to that, or maybe we'll get to that later on, just give us, Polina, your 2-3 minute intro to how the particular business came about, and I guess a potted history of where you are up until now.
Yeah, so Wanderu started from my own frustration with booking bus travel when I was living in New York City. I was running a PR firm, which I started when I was a sophomore at Babson College. And when I graduated, I moved out to New York City, didn't have a car, and I traveled all the time by bus and train travel because it was the most convenient way to get around. And bus companies had power outlets and Wi-Fi that allowed me to connect and get work done during my trip, turn it into a little mobile office. But despite the fact that traveling by bus was super convenient, I found the booking process to be a huge headache because many of the providers didn't even have mobile websites. And so, and there's actually more options going, let's say, between DC and New York than there are flights that go between that same route. So you'd have to go to 10 different websites to see who's traveling, the time you want to travel, for what price. And normally, I would want to do that through my mobile phone, but I would have to go to a local Starbucks, plug in my computer, and go to a bunch of desktop sites, sometimes even have to download PDF schedules. So this was back in 2011 when I was experiencing this problem. And then I kind of kept putting up with it as I was running my PR firm. But then during the summer of 2011, I got together with a group of friends and we wanted to do a cross-country road trip to raise awareness for national parks and forests. And so we started a blog to document our trip, and we thought, how can we get young people to pay attention? And so we decided, instead of just, doing a regular rent a car and drive cross country, we would ride share cross country. So get complete strangers to give us rides from place to place. And this was kind of pre-Uber and Lyft days, so people thought we were completely insane trying to hitch the country, which of course is not what we were doing. We were, telling that, we're going to find people online. We'll make sure to look at their social media accounts, basically all the things that Uber now does for you, background check and all of that. And so I used my PR background to get us local media in all the places that we were going through. And so we had, local newspapers writing about us, people writing in and offering us rides and wanting to be part of this journey with us. And so we had everything set up for our trip. And we got from New York to Washington, D.C., then to Shenandoah National Park, which is beautiful, and then to the Jefferson Forest in Virginia, and to a tiny town called Newcastle. And at that point, we got a call from our next rideshare that said, hey, really sorry, something came up and I can't give you guys a ride to your next destination, which was Indianapolis. And so we thought, oh crap, we didn't really have a plan B for this. So we don't have a car. And so we thought maybe there's a bus or train that can get us to our next destination. So we turned to Google like any millennial does, looked for bus or train from Newcastle, Virginia to Indianapolis. And, there's no magic bus that just goes into a tiny town of like 50 people in the middle of a forest. So there was nothing there. And we thought, okay, maybe we could find the closest major city and get a ride, locally to the closest major city, which is closer than Indianapolis. And so closest city that we could find a bus was Salem, Virginia. And there was a bus that served Salem, but it did not go all the way to Indianapolis. So somewhere along the way, we'd have to connect with another bus or train. And so we tried to, combine different options and look at different cities that we could route through manually, and spent over an hour trying to figure it out, and we couldn't. So we ended up having to rent a car, which at that point, felt like a massive failure for our campaign. But now, yeah, reflecting on it, it's one of those things that is like the tipping point, the moment where I got myself and another person on the trip who's now my co-founder just so frustrated wanting to solve this problem where, I can get anywhere I want, figure out anything I want on the internet, but I can't figure out how to get from point A to point B using, different forms of transportation. So that's where the origin for Wanderu started. And that was back, the idea came to us in 2011, the end of 2011. We formally became a company beginning of 2012 and started building out the product that you see today.
Okay. Personal experience. I mean, there's so many have been kind of founded on those personal frustrations. David, you was going to chime in with something there.
Yeah. No, so I'm curious, obviously the problem has existed for a while, but something in the bus industry changed to make aggregating them possible. And I remember one of the first times we met 5 or 6 years ago, you were telling me about how one of your chief challenges was dealing with these various owners at various local bus companies that basically didn't want to be shown next to their competitor. And so I'd love to just hear a little perspective about what you think changed in the market. And then kind of a second question is like, how are you able to convince some of these, companies to work with you?
Yeah, it was definitely the biggest challenge, and bringing partners on board. Any marketplace business, right? You need to have the seller side down, but in order to get the seller side down, you need to have enough buyers that are interested and willing to buy. I think very early on, we, before we launched anything to the public, partially because we didn't have anything to launch, we set up kind of a sign up for our private beta. We're able to generate some buzz around the concept, which allowed us to get a good amount of signups before we were ready to go live just in the Northeast market. I think two of the things that allowed us to get to where we are now, and that I think were important for us to do in the beginning, was getting the initial interest from the consumer side and getting enough people signed up to use our product before our product was ready to go to the public. So starting to generate that interest, and at the same time focusing on not looking at it as like the whole country, but most people travel by bus and train regionally, right? So most people are willing to sit on a bus for maybe 4 or 5 hours. Anything beyond that, it becomes fewer and fewer people that are willing to do that. And so we realized that bus travel is actually very regional. It's not very national. So having a company in New York and having a company in California and a company in Chicago is not really going to make our product valuable. So what would make our product most valuable is if we have at least 50% coverage of any particular region that we are in before we go live. And so we focus on the Northeast because it's the biggest travel corridor in the country. And so our goal, instead of getting as many partners as we can nationally, was, get at least 50% coverage of the Northeast, so that when people search for particular routes, they're able to see enough where we are valuable to the customer. And that also allowed us to focus on the types of partners that we went after. And so going to partners, I think, it was a lot more helpful where we already had users that were ready to use the product. The other thing that really we really focused on was understanding what value we are bringing to the bus partners, right? So instead of just saying, hey, we're going to put you on a website and compare you to all of your competitors so that we're basically making your product, a commodity. What we focused on is, we're going to help you expand your network. Because we're a point-to-point search, we're able to combine multiple providers together. So a company that might only serve, New Hampshire is now going to be connected to companies that serve other states and will become a feeder service to actually help them grow the market. And on top of that, we went and brought on the former CEO of Greyhound, Craig Lynch, as an advisor very early on, and he helped us understand the reasons that the bus companies may not want to work with us, and gave us a lot of understanding of what is important to them, what scares them, and also how we can differentiate our product and create something that's actually valuable to our partners. So those are the things that we did in the beginning to help break through some of those barriers. Then once we actually got partners on board, they were satisfied with the results, and the industry is very small. So even though they don't like a lot of their competitors, everybody talks. And so you really only get one first impression for this market. And so if you kind of oversell and underdeliver, you're not going to be able to keep that partner. But not only that, that partner will tell everybody else, and you're going to have a hard time getting more partners in the future.
It's interesting. I mean, a few of these podcasts, the people that we spoke to, they talk about their frustrations with, talking to initial partners and almost kind of selling the story to their potential customers and people that are going to help them build a brand. And I'm particularly interested in, how do you do that as the CEO to the rest of the company? Because obviously there must be some initial kind of setbacks. I mean, how do you keep up the encouragement within the team that, this is all going to work out? We just need, like you say, the word of mouth around the partners and some help and stuff like that. How do you kind of behave as a CEO to kind of cajole everybody along with you?
Yeah, it's a tough challenge. I think, making sure you celebrate the wins is really important. And we're also very transparent as a company, right? So, when things aren't going as we want them to go, we share that openly with the people that work at Wanderu, because we feel that it's important that people have the ownership and that we work together to strive for, fixing things and making things better. And maybe someone has an idea of how we can do something that, I don't immediately have, or someone else on the executive team doesn't immediately have. So being able to crowdsource and share those ideas from, the really smart people that you hire is, at least for me, extremely helpful. But I think in the beginning, there is that sense of wanting to shelter your team from bad news. And the best way that you can do that is really have good news to counterbalance that, and really be able to celebrate those things, and even the smaller wins, right? So, maybe going after some of the smaller partners first and showing value to them, because if you go after, one of the things that happened to us really early on, that at the time felt like, a stab in the heart and like the end of our company, but in reality was the best thing that could have happened to us, was we had a final, this was pre-launch, right? So we were going to South by Southwest, where we were competing for, the most innovative technology award in their startup competition. And we had a contract. At that point, we had a couple partners already signed. We were pre-beta launch, so we hadn't launched to the public yet, but we were pretty far along. And we wanted to get, partners in place before we were ready to launch. And so we had a pretty much final contract that was approved by lawyers from both sides with Megabus. And we were hoping to get that signed, and we were kind of pressuring them to get that signed so that we could make a major announcement at South by Southwest, and get both of us some press. And we decided to almost replicate our cross-country trip, which we did, that kind of kicked off the start of our company. And so we decided to take buses and trains only using the Wanderu search to Austin for South by Southwest. And I remember I was on a Megabus and I got an email from Megabus saying, hey, we're going to have to put this contract on hold and delay it for 6 months, whatever, right? Which in startup world is eternity. And it was just like, I just wanted off that bus right now, like on a Megabus, and I'm so angry at them. And And so I remember just thinking, this is it. Like, this was our major announcement. This is what we need to like really get that credibility going. And like, again, we had some partners at that point, but they weren't as big as Megabus, which is a national carrier. And so it was just, at the time, again, a very deep low to where we thought we were going to be, especially going into that competition, which, by the way, we ended up winning Most Innovative Technology at South by Southwest that year, even without that partnership. And so later on, we ended up launching. And of course, as any launch goes, we had, maybe 15, 20,000 people signed up for beta, which was great, but it's not like we were selling, thousands of tickets from day one, as any launch with any startup goes. We launched in August and we were selling, a few tickets, and it went up to, dozens of tickets, and slowly we started growing. We grew very fast, but, going from 1 to 100 is very fast, but it's not, going to make you a massive business. So, as we continued to grow, we continued to add more partners, and we were growing at some point for that year after we launched, we were growing about 400% quarter over quarter. So we kind of grew very quickly. And then about another pretty much 6 months after that, we ended up signing that contract with Megabus. And at that point, we actually were doing some real sales. So when we launched Megabus, they were able to actually see value from Wanderu because we were able to actually sell tickets. And so it's funny because I have a very good relationship with the former president of Megabus. He's stepped down maybe about a year ago. And, I shared the story with him, how mad at them I was. And he's like, yeah, we actually, we did that on purpose because we knew you weren't ready for it. Right? Like he says jokingly, but in reality, it's actually very true. Like, reflecting on it, if we had launched Megabus, if they were our launch partner, right, and we launched with them and we had, I don't know, a few hundred people going to our website per day at the time. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was, we just launched as a company, so it wasn't astronomical numbers, right? We probably would have lost that partnership. We would have shown them that we're not that valuable. And at the end of the day, if we lost that partnership, it would have been much harder to come back and then convince them to work with us. But because they didn't sign that contract at that point, and only when we became a bit bigger did we actually finalize that partnership. At that point, when they launched, we were selling a good number for them, and then we continued to grow 400% each quarter. So they really saw kind of the fast growth that was happening. And so we are still partners with them to this day. And in fact, we're, as far as I know, they're one of the only partners that works with Megabus, and we have a very good relationship that we probably would not have had if we had launched and shown that we're not really selling anything.
Everything happens for a reason, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's one of those things that you kind of, as a founder, you go through these moments where you think, it's the end of the world. And, sometimes it is, right? Sometimes these moments, sometimes losing a big contract will actually kill your company. But I think it's better to lose that big contract before you have built a company than if you, screw up a relationship or lose a big contract in the middle of actually, doing a lot in sales, because it's much harder to get those partners back at that point.
Yeah.
So following up on that story, which is a fantastic story, by the way, I feel like a common piece of advice to startup entrepreneurs is launch as quickly as possible, or you can never launch, too quickly because you need to start getting data. It sounds like you had a very targeted rollout from basically drumming up a lot of PR. So you did have those 20,000 signups to then whether or not, this was like you just told us it wasn't on purpose, but a blessing in disguise, you ended up having a phased rollout when it came to suppliers as well with Megabus. And so, do you have any general advice about how to think about that, about when to launch and when not to, and when to maybe not risk sabotaging that relationship?
Yeah, I think, again, for us, our plan was always to do a phased rollout, right? So, we knew that having a critical mass in any particular region before we go live is important. I think a lot of our competitors thought a little bit differently, and their strategy was very different. And, it's up to them to say whether it worked for them or not. But we have been very methodical with our, focus on, being the best in the areas that we are in before we expand to more regions and more areas. And I think that it really varies from company to company, but it goes back to kind of the MVP, right? Where we are very deeply rooted in a culture of testing and getting feedback from our users as quickly as possible and iterating. And it's very hard to do that if you try to be all things at once and in all regions and all areas. And I think it's really important as a startup to ship quickly and get out there quickly, but have a solid product when you do that, right? So if we had launched with just one carrier, it probably would not have been very useful to our users either, and we probably would have lost a lot of our users too, right? So waiting until we had at least 50% coverage was important for us so that we could provide a product that was valuable to the user. And the reason why we went with 50% was talking to a bunch of users and getting their feedback on what would be valuable to them and why they would use our product. And so I think that for each startup, it's important to move quickly and get something out there and get feedback as quickly as possible, and then test and iterate from there. And ultimately, if you're building a consumer business or any business, you got to talk to your customers and understand what's important for them, what's valuable for them, and what that MVP will look like. Because if you launch with a crappy product, right, even if you get out quickly, then you're also potentially alienating your customers and not going to be able to get another chance with them either.
It's interesting. I mean, I love the way that you've thought through this all, but I'm kind of curious, Polina, about, because you have this focus on millennials or younger generations. Is that something that the style of it is? Forgive me if I'm wrong, I'm not a millennial, but the style of the site seems to be aimed at a younger generation as well. Is that something that came out in your customer discovery, that was going to be the target base? And why did you focus on them? Is it because there weren't older generations that were using bus and train at that stage?
Yeah, I mean, so what we found, so the history of the bus industry over the past 20 years is actually very interesting, because the type of person that took a bus 20 years ago is very different than the type of person that takes a bus now. And if you kind of look at those demographics, they've shifted quite heavily towards millennials. And a lot of that happened very shortly around the time that Megabus launched. And the reason why is because, 20 years ago, buses, there wasn't a whole lot of competition, and it was kind of a dying industry. And it was predominantly, people that, walk up to the bus station, purchase their tickets, tended to be skew older, and kind of people that couldn't afford other forms of transportation. And when companies like Megabus launched, they only sold tickets online. They call them curbside carriers, where they pick you up, drop you off at the curbside. So the only way you can buy a ticket if you don't purchase it online is by standing in line, standby. And then if there's seats, then they will sell you a ticket, but there's no kind of guarantee that you will get on unless you buy that ticket online. But also they started offering powerless and Wi-Fi. And so that attracted a demographic of travelers that were traditionally not, they grew up using the internet, and also millennials are less likely to own cars, right? So there's this whole kind of appeal where you have somebody else drive you, plus you can get on a bus and use powerless and Wi-Fi. And so all of a sudden, millennials started flocking to bus travel, and then bus travel became the fastest growing form of transportation. So while, short haul flights dropped, 25% over a 5-year period, bus companies were growing 7-8% year over year. And other forms of transportation were pretty much flat. And so they started taking market share from short haul flight carriers, right? Especially in markets between DC, New York, Boston. And so when we and I was the same, right? Like, I never took a bus before. Megabus, I think, was the first bus company that I ended up taking shortly after they launched. I actually heard about it from my parents. They're like, oh, there's this bus company that has Wi-Fi. And I was like, oh, how cool. I really want to go on a bus. And I had never even considered taking a bus before. In fact, when I was in high school, I used to drive between New York and Boston. And I went to college in New York City, and I had a minivan at the time, and I would drive. And now I don't own a car at all. And, I take bus and train travel. And so it was really interesting, that shift that happened, because it's not just about prices, it's about the convenience, but it's also about being connected, and it's kind of cool, right? To be able to buy the tickets online, you're at the curbside and you have other people like you. And so the demographic shifted pretty heavily, and it happened pretty recently. And we just came in at the time when it was happening because, again, I was one of those people, one of those millennials that were kind of driving bus travel forward. And so that's kind of the reason why I got into it, because, I'm a millennial myself. And at the same time, I found that, traditional travel sites didn't offer these other travel modes, probably because, much bigger companies, it takes them much longer time to kind of catch on to the trends. And at the same time, everybody else in the travel industry is kind of fighting over the same customer, the same demographic, the same, offerings and hotels and flights, and it's all kind of the same. It's just who's got more money to spend on attracting people on Google, or television ads or whatever it is, right? But like, if you look at the actual offerings, they're not really any different. And so when we came into the space, started offering bus travel, and then we expanded to train travel. Now we have ferries. We're about to launch flights as well. But we were very focused on kind of being point to point and serving a demographic of users that could not go anywhere else to book bus and train travel. But at the same time, they're the most tech savvy, demographic that is so used to having things super easy, right? So having to go to 12 different websites didn't make any sense. And so I think that's kind of like, yes, our brand is geared towards millennials. Anybody could use Wanderu, and we have plenty of people all ages that use Wanderu. Yeah. But at the same time, the 80% of bus travelers are now millennials, right? And so that's why millennials and Gen Z, right? The next generation of travelers. And so when we think about our brand, we think about we want to be the travel brand for the next generation, for future generations of travelers. And, bus and train travel allowed us to start by giving them an offering that they weren't able to get elsewhere. But as we continue to expand, right, we're helping them solve, how do I get from point A to point B, long distance. So that's bus, train, ferry, and flights as well, being able to combine all those modes of transport together into one itinerary, which we do to this day. Like, a lot of companies talk about multimodal, a lot of companies talk about, oh, well, we have bus, train, ferry, and all of that, but we actually do it, right? Like, right now you can book an Amtrak with a Bolt bus together, right? And so, like, being able to combine those options, and once we launch flights, being able to say, okay, I want to take a train to Providence Airport and then fly to Fort Lauderdale. So actually being able to put that into one itinerary, and that's kind of very geared towards the demographic that wants to do those like travel hacks and find better deals. And so it all kind of fits into the brand and to the users that we currently have today.
Okay.
So a follow-up question on that. I did not know the history about how Megabus basically helped redefine bus travel. I think there's a new wave of innovation coming now. I'm an investor in Cabin, which is an overnight bus company from SF to LA. There's a lot of hype around Flixbus, et cetera. I'm curious how you view the market evolving. Are these similar transformations to the Megabus one? Because I feel like there still is a stigma attached to bus travel being for more lower income and just not being as smooth. So yeah, I'm curious to see where you see the industry going.
Yeah, I mean, I think luxury buses are definitely exciting. I think that, and we see this as well, because, our demographic, we see our customers getting older and shift to more luxury products. Like, people that were, booking bus tickets all the time are now starting to book train tickets more often, because they are coming into, their careers and making more money. And for them, it's more comfortable. We have several partners that offer luxury services everywhere from Florida to, the DC, New York, Boston market. So there's a number of companies that are luxury bus. It will be interesting to see luxury bus services on a national scale. That's yet to happen. So there's a number of brands that kind of focus on luxury service, but only kind of point to point in the small markets that they're in, but not on a large scale like Greyhound or Amtrak or Megabus are. So I think that will be very interesting. I definitely think that as people continue to, mature in age and in these demographics, right, and start coming into money, I don't really see car ownership necessarily growing as much as it used to. And that's backed up by statistics, right, where fewer people now own cars. I think what will change this pretty drastically will be self-driving vehicles, and as those become more accessible, because again, I don't enjoy driving, but if I have a car that will drive me around on my own and I have the money to afford it, then the proposition becomes different, right? Whether I'm taking a bus or a train or having a car that can drive itself. But I also think that this generation and future generations are a lot more eco-conscious, and I think that plays into the bus and train industry a lot as well, and just, caring about the environment and wanting to take cars off the road. I think that a lot of our customers find an appeal to that, and that's harder. I think smaller shuttle services, especially on-demand smaller shuttle services between cities that can kind of be spun up, where you don't necessarily need to fill a bus with 55 seats, but you can take a shuttle that can fit maybe 15, 20 people to get to certain destinations, is an interesting concept as well. But in general, we see our partners getting more and more interested in using data to power their decisions versus, historically where it was kind of a estimated guess and could cost them a lot of money. More and more companies are, even coming to us and asking us for help with their own understanding of data and how to use data to kind of power their own thinking as they continue to expand.
It's interesting. I think, take note, David, I think there's a podcast further down the line all on autonomous vehicles and the concept of mobility as a service. And it kind of strikes me, just as a comment rather than a question, that, a brand like Wanderu is probably quite in an interesting spot for the evolution of mobility as a service once autonomous vehicles come online. But I do want to shift a little bit. Let's talk about kind of your investment and your funding and things like that. Forgive me if I'm incorrect, but I'd say that for a consumer-facing travel startup, your investment so far is a fairly modest amount. Is that? Would you agree?
Yes, and we're very proud of that. I think some of the best businesses in travel, have not necessarily raised that much money. In fact, I think TripAdvisor raised something like $2 or $3 million total, and one would argue they're probably the most successful in terms of traffic. And so I think for us, we don't associate the value of our business with how much money we raise. In fact, every time you raise money, you're selling off a chunk of your company, right? Yep. And we've been able to, our focus has been, how do we build a sustainable business that can make money? With our Series A round, our goal was to get to a place where we can become profitable. And so in 2017, in the summer of 2017, we hit profitability. We were profitable for the rest of that year. Then this past August, we took on a little bit of money for just to kind of scale up marketing, but it wasn't anything that we really we didn't go out and raise a Series B round, because for us, it's not about, let's every 12 to 18 months go and raise a bunch of money. And we probably will go out and raise a large round at some point in the future. But again, it's based off of data that we know these unit economics make sense, and we can actually take that money and scale it out, versus let's raise as much money as possible, spend all that money so that we can grow, even though the metrics and numbers will never make sense.
And clearly, if you're, again, my words, the modest amount, I mean, you're clearly not just spending it on marketing, because you would probably need a lot more if you were spending it on keywords and going up against others in the ground transportation sector. I mean, how have you earmarked, first of all, that money around the business, and what do you do with it?
Yeah, I mean, we test a lot, right? So testing is a big thing for us. So, a lot of the things that we have built to scale are all built internally in-house. So we've built our own ad bidding platform. So that requires a lot of really smart engineers, right? And so in order to be efficient, we believe technology is the best way to scale. Instead of spending tons of money and giving it to agencies or whatever it is, we bring everything in-house. So we have custom CMS system that we built out that powers all of our landing pages. We have a custom in-house ad bidding platform that's uses machine learning to optimize bids. We have a ton of really smart people and engineers that help us kind of scale out our marketing efforts that allow us to be a lot more successful. And so I think, and again, we're relatively small compared to a lot of companies, right? So we're now up to about 60 people. That's grown about double over the past year or so. But at the same time, we're still very small compared to a number of companies that have raised lots of money in the travel space. But we are very we're very focused on where we allocate those resources, and we test a lot of things, and then when it makes sense, we scale them out.
Okay, just last one from me for a while. This is a story that you shared with Inc.com when you were trying to raise money. Fairly awful thing that you experienced, and that was with regards to the reaction that you got from an investor when you went to pitch for some money. Could you just give us a very quick overview as to what happened and your sense now whether that kind of scenario will have altered or not in more current climate, or do you think it's still something that's prevalent? But just give us your perspective on what happened, because I think it's important for any entrepreneur, particularly female CEO entrepreneurs, to hear this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the particular case that you're referring to was when we were raising our Series A, and we were growing very fast at the time. That was when we were growing about 400% each quarter. We had credible metrics. We had all these partnerships in place, and we actually, garnered a good amount of interest in our fundraising. But I went and met with a very prominent VC fund in New York City, and I had met with several partners already, and this was a step where I was meeting with one of the founding general partners of the fund. So this is basically the person that says yes or no. And I came in there and I, knew my shit. I'd been kind of pitching for a month or so, maybe 2 months at the time. And as the CEO of the company, I have a male co-founder, but as the CEO, I do the pitching to investors. And so I went into the pitch, and, I went through my pitch deck as I did all these other times. And, I noticed that the person wasn't really paying too much attention and was kind of looking at me. And after I finished my pitch, he looks at me, he's like, I don't typically invest in founders like you. And I was really taken back because I didn't know what that means. And so I said, what do you mean? And he wasn't expecting me to ask what he meant. And so he tried to come up with a way to explain it. He's like, well, I normally invest in people that are more analytical. And I looked at him like, you don't know anything about me. Why do you think that I am not analytical? It was very clear that he was saying that he does not invest in women. And I just remember I've been rejected by investors before, but this felt much deeper, right? Because what this person said out loud was probably what other investors that I had pitched to were thinking and didn't say out loud. And I just remember leaving that meeting and calling my co-founder, and I was almost in tears because it was just so hurtful.
Yeah.
And just thinking, maybe you should be the one that's raising money, right? Because you look more analytical apparently as a male. And so, so that was definitely a point of time for me where I thought, you know what, I want to get to a place where, we have a business that if we don't need to raise money, we don't have to, right? Yeah. And so with our Series A, our focus was on building that business into profitability, but it was also on proving that investor wrong, right? And yeah. And there's still, I think that it's still a problem to this day, right? If you look at statistics, a very small, less than 10% of funding goes to female founders. Less than 10% of VCs are women. And it's one of those things that it's the only way that that's going to change is if it changes probably from the top, because realistically people invest in people like them. And, we got a lot of rejections in the beginning because people thought that the bus industry is, not sexy and it's not going to go anywhere. And, nobody cares about buses and millennials aren't really riding buses and all of these excuses, because realistically investors would never find themselves on a bus. And so it's not, it's much easier to invest in something that you can imagine using. But when the problem is not that you can relate to the product, it's that you can't, as a man, relate to the person on the other side that is pitching to you. That is something I can't change, right? I can have a product in a, $100 billion, $1 trillion industry that, has excellent barriers of entry and is growing ridiculously fast, but I'm not, I can't change being a woman when I go to pitch an investor. I can send my co-founder in, but I refuse to perpetuate the issue. And honestly, I would rather not have investors that don't invest in women, right? I would rather not have those people on my team. And so I was very fortunate to find very supportive investors, very supportive, our board members. But I think that this is still very much a problem in this industry. And I hope that it changes over time. But the only way it's going to change is if you have more female VCs at the partner level that can make decisions that, I don't think anybody should invest in a company because it's led by a woman. I think you should invest in a company because it's a great company. But at the end of the day, the problem will continue to happen when there isn't enough representation of, that sex in the industry.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, that's quite the story. I feel like asking any other questions about normal business operations after that is inappropriate. But I wanted to ask, something a little bit more in the weeds. You obviously had to work with bus companies at various stages of technical competence. Some of whom may have not had a website at all. Some of whom may have a full API. How did you kind of manage? I think that when you're aggregating any industry, you're going to have that discrepancy in technical capabilities, and your job as an aggregator is going to sit as a layer on top of that and provide a uniform user experience to the users. Could you maybe just talk a little bit more about how you tackled that problem and how you thought about it?
Yeah, honestly, I don't know which one was more challenging, getting partners on board or integrating with the partners. The bus industry in the US is, significantly behind a lot of bus companies in other parts of the world that we have worked with in terms of technology, especially around the time that we were starting. APIs virtually did not exist. And, going and scraping websites would bring those websites down because they couldn't handle the load. And so we had to do a lot of custom integrations, a lot of things on our side that would allow us to, get data in a scalable way, and everything from building our own, ticketing reservation type integration to, integrating with APIs to, figuring out how to sit on top of the reservation systems of the bus companies. So every integration was pretty much a custom integration. And I think that's one of the biggest barriers to entry into the space is just the lack of technology there, and just the sheer amount of data. I mean, we have billions of data points in our warehouse that we have to, that we've had to sort and standardize. So unlike, the airline space where you have the middle layer technologies that kind of standardize all that data, but they were able to get that data in a way where even the station codes, carrier codes were all standardized already. We've had to do all of that ourselves. And that's also one of the reasons why we launched just in the Northeast, is just the sheer amount of data and trying to figure out how to scale that was a huge challenge. And why we're still building out and getting smarter our systems to this day. So just from when we had the idea to actually launching our first product, it took, over a year to get something live. Almost a year and a half. Like we started working on the product, very beginning of 2012. We launched in August of 2013. So that's more than a year and a half of just building out the technology and integrating partners just for the Northeast of the US. And luckily the systems that we built out we were able to use across other partners, but we still, we don't have one way to integrate with a partner, where a lot of companies will say, okay, if you don't have an API, you have to build one. Bus companies, they don't have tech teams to go and build that. And so we've just had to build our own technology to be able to integrate those carriers.
It's interesting. I mean, so many consumer-facing travel startups have tried the consumer route first of all, and then have pivoted, in inverted commas, to doing a B2B. Is that something that you've resisted, or is it something that you would consider alongside the consumer-facing product? Given, because it's interesting, I would imagine that there are lots of OTAs, for example, or something that would be dying for a white label of what you do potentially.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we are starting now to consider. Our focus has always been kind of on building the brand, right? And you can't do everything at once, right? So again, like going back to our roots has really been about hyper focus. Like we've had partners that ask us to build certain technologies for them that could be a great SaaS business, but we don't take those on because we're hyper focused on the things that we need to get done, and you only have so many resources and time. And I think that's the biggest thing for us why we haven't pursued the B2B side of things is in terms of kind of other OTAs is, we believe strongly that we have a great product and we have a great brand, and we've been able to prove that we can grow and build out our customer base. We have some of the highest retention rates in travel in terms of, customers that purchase a ticket on Wanderu that come back to purchase another ticket. And so, we kind of have, of course, marketing costs money and is work, but at the same time, maybe it's an ego thing, but we think we do things better than a lot of the companies out there. And so on a user experience side, right? And so user experience is really, really important for us. And that's been a big part of our brand and our product. And so we've been hyper-focused on that, and we've seen success in that. I think that, a lot of the companies that switch over to B2B may have a harder time acquiring users or maybe keeping those users. And so B2B makes sense to kind of pivot to grow faster. But because we've been able to scale and grow so fast on the consumer side of things, we haven't been as motivated to test out the B2B. But that doesn't mean that it's not something that we won't consider in the future, now that we have that established kind of brand and customer base.
Yeah.
So I wanted to quickly delve a little bit into that on the brand side. I think the only travel startups that I've seen recently be able to build a consumer brand have kind of figured out a secret to how to reach customers. So for example, Kiwi.com was the first to route budget carriers with historical carriers, and then was ranking at the top of kayak searches, for example. And that was kind of a hack, and it reminded me kind of how Zynga piggybacked off of Facebook to gather a bunch of consumers. Is there, like, you mentioned some splash pages, you mentioned you have your own custom bidding. Are these like the secret sauce that has led to you be able to do this? Is there I guess, is there something that you have done that has kind of really made the difference more than anything else?
Yeah, I think on the getting customers in the door, especially in the early days, SEO was a big driver for us. And again, a lot of that was scaled out by systems that we built, and also just having useful content. I think content is the most important thing, and high conversions. So when somebody comes and lands on a page, they're finding the information they're looking for. They're, moving down the funnel, purchasing tickets, and that signals to Google that this is valuable, and that this is the right content that people want to see when they search for particular terms. But I don't think that long-term that's what makes a consumer business successful, right? I think once people come in the door, it's all about product, and it's all about user experience and customer service, right? If they have a good experience with your product, one, they will keep coming back, and two, they will spread the word and tell their friends. You know, in surveying a lot of our power users, a lot of them found us through, you know, some form of ad, whether, you know, we've done some out of home stuff, but a lot of them have heard of us from their friends, right? Their friends travel a lot and they tell them about us. And so, you know, if you go onto social media, there are a lot of mentions about Wanderu that are just organic. You know, we have, you know, vloggers, bloggers talking about us, and we don't have currently, you know, a influencer program where we're paying people to talk about us. And I think, you know, if you have a product that is good and provides a good user experience and solves a problem for the customer, and they have a good experience with you, the best marketing is word of mouth and getting customers that will tell their friends and recommend you to their friends or, you know, their followers or whatever it is, without you having to pay them. If you have to pay people to talk about you, it's not genuine, right? And although you might get some customers in the door that way, it's more important to figure out how to get customers to stay, because if you can get 10 customers in the door and get those 10 customers to tell 10 other customers, you have a viral effect. Whereas it's much harder to pay for, you know, 10 customers and then convince 10 more, you know, pay for 10 more customers over and over again. And so I think that that's where, you know, we were very focused on providing a great user experience, and everything from, you know, the website to, you know, if someone has a problem, we have an amazing customer support team that are oftentimes doing support on behalf of carriers, because carriers don't often have great customer support teams. And so this is where we've been able to really, you know, get that viral effect going, where we have customers that actually go and spread the word to other people, and it becomes a lot more genuine.
Yeah, that's and it's just a terrific example, I must say, Polina, and one that's probably quite rare in the travel industry. So, you know, well done with doing that. So, just two very quick fire questions. The first one comes from me, and what's your kind of end game with this? Is it just to grow it as big as it is, or do you see some kind of suitor that would come along at some point and find you a good home?
I mean, we're a venture-funded company, right? So our investors would probably not be happy if we just permanently did not do anything. At some point, we will, you know, have some sort of exit, whether it's an IPO or an acquisition. It's not something that we are focused on, you know, today, where, you know, there's still so much that we want to do, and we have so much ahead of us. You know, we're just about to launch flights, as I mentioned. And with that, we want to continue to build out our brand and double down on our thesis that, you know, we don't believe traditional travel sites are appealing to our demographic of travelers, where, you know, the future generations of travelers, where they're still, you know, showing all of the same offerings. Like, I think there is a deep need for something like us that isn't just about, you know, transportation, but even on the, you know, where do I stay once I get there? What do I do once I get there? And so, you know, we see ourselves continuing to build out and go in the direction of building this travel brand for future generations of travelers, not just on the, you know, how do I get from point A to point B, but also, you know, what are the differences in the places that these people stay, and what are the differences in what these people do that the traditional, you know, travel sites are not offering them, and how can we continue to build out our product in such a way that we're appealing to this demographic. And so, you know, for now, we're just continuing to chug along and continuing to build out, you know, what we're probably going to end up doing, you know, a sizable Series B round at some point in the future, and just continue to, you know, double down, triple down, and build out our brand in the travel space.
Okay, David?
Very cool. So last question isn't very serious. I'm just curious if there's any background about the fact that your logo is a monkey and any background on the name, or if there's any story there.
Yeah, so in, you know, the very beginning, when we were brainstorming kind of what we wanted to be, right? We always knew that we wanted to be a travel brand, not just a bus search. And so we wanted to appeal to, you know, our demographic of travelers. And so we were thinking, you know, when I travel, like what are the words that really inspire me? And the word wander just really kind of stuck, right? Where it's like, you're just going, you're exploring. You don't necessarily always have to have a destination. You just, it's, the root for wanderlust, just wanting to go and explore the world. And so I really like the word wander. And so we started just adding sounds to the end of it. And Wanderu just kind of flew off the tongue. And at first we were thinking kind of like Wanderu, kangaroo. There's Australia has this, for some reason I associate Australia with travel as well. A lot of people in Australia like to travel the world because, once you leave there, you might as well travel for a long time because it takes so long to get anywhere. And so we thought maybe initially to have kind of a kangaroo as a mascot, but then when we Googled the name to see if the name was taken yet, we found that Wanderu is actually a type of monkey. So there's a Wanderu monkey that is an endangered monkey in India, in southern India. And it was super cute. So it was perfect. We're like, okay, great. We have a name and we have a mascot. So that's why we have a monkey. It's actually the Wanderu monkey, and it had the name before we did. So we are sharing it.
Great.
Very cool. So I think that's all from us today. First of all, thank you very much for joining us. That was super insightful. Again, this has been How I Got Here with Mozio and PhocusWire. I'm David Litwak, who's the CEO of Mozio, and we're doing this with kmay, who's at PhocusWire. And thank you very much for your time, Polina. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to the How I Got Here podcast. We'll be back next week with more inside stories behind startups and innovation in travel and transportation. Check mozio.com/move for a complete write-up of the highlights of every podcast with translations into 5 languages, and get your daily dose of news on the digital travel economy by subscribing to the newsletter at PhocusWire.com. See you next week.